Hello chess fans and welcome to Chess 5, and we are going to talk about the game between Magnus Carlsen versus E06 and this game is from the FIDE World Championship match number 2. The first match between these two players went into a draw where E06 was playing with the white pieces and Magnus Carlsen was playing with the black pieces. But now in the second game we have Magnus Carlsen playing with the white pieces and Nepomniachtchi playing with the black pieces. So let's check it out what happened in the game very quickly. And yep, this game was actually very interesting and you're going to love this game a lot. So first of all, before starting the game, if you're new to my channel, then make sure to subscribe to the channel and please make sure to click the notification bell because I'm going to analyze every game so that you will always get the notification whenever I would be uploading new videos. So okay, so Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces in the match number 2 started the game with 1d4 and black with the black pieces replied with knight to f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, and after d5 many players thought that Magnus would go for knight to c3 variation and we have the queen's gambit decline. But he chose g3 variation and we have now the queen's gambit Catalan variation. Bishop e7, bishop g2, castle by black, castle by white, and now black decided to capture the pawn on c4. Okay, this is all theory, very normal theory. And after d into c4, the two common ways to continue the position is to play knight to e5 or playing queen to a4, where white instantly grabbed the pawn on c4 on the next move. But Carlsen chose to play queen to c2 in this position. And after queen to c2, white is threatening to capture the pawn on c4, but in this variation, black is having the choice to protect the pawn on c4. And there's the only way to protect the pawn is to play b5. After b5, it's a very normal way to protect the pawn on c4, but all the players who are looking at this position their first time, they would be thinking like the bishop on g2 is like simply hitting the rook on a8, so why not to move the knight and hit the rook? And look, after knight e5 was played by Magnus Carlsen, at the place of playing knight e5, first of all, a much better move in this position would have been to play a4. And after a4, white is instantly hitting the pawn on b5. And here, the best way to continue this position is to play bishop to b7. If you try to go for protecting the pawn on b5 by playing c6, then after simply a pawn trade, and now white is having a very powerful move, which is knight to g5. After knight g5, white is threatening a double attack on the pawn on h7, as well as now the rook is hanging on a8. So in this position, you cannot play knight to d5, protecting the rook because now there is a queen into h7 and it's game over for black. So this was the reason why black cannot play c6, and you cannot play a6 as well because of the a into b5. You cannot capture because the rook is hanging. So after a4, the usual way to continue the position is to play bishop b7. After pawn takes a6, pawn takes, knight takes, queen takes, and here white is a pawn up, but black is having a fine compensation, so which makes the game even. Okay, so playable for both the sides. So at the place of a4, Magnus chose knight to e5 variation, and in the press conference after the game, Magnus told that a4 would have been the best move, but he thought that Nepomniachtchi would have came up with a better plan because a4 is the most natural move in this position. So in the practical chess, he decided to play something else like knight e5, hitting the rook. And here after knight to e5, black is having two ways to protect the rook. He can either play c6 or he can either go for playing knight to d5. We have c6 by black and we have now a4 by white. You can also go for capturing the pawn on c6, but it would have been not a nice idea because after knight into c6, bishop into c6, rook b8, and after rook b8, you can just count the material. White is having the 7 pawn and black is also having the 7 pawn. But here black can simply play bishop b7 and trade the key bishop from the white side, which would not be a good idea for white. So that was the reason knight into c6 would have not been the best move, and we have the a4 by Magnus, the right move. And now white is already threatening to capture the pawn on b5 because black cannot capture because the rook is hanging. So black first played knight to d5 so that after capture, the bishop cannot capture the rook. So here Magnus first played knight to c3, and now it's a double attack. So Ian first played f6, hitting the knight from the e5 square, and now the white knight is having the two squares to go on g4, or he can go for to f3. And the most common reply looks to play something knight to f3, which was played by Magnus. Knight g4 would have not been the best move because A no scope for the knight to go from g4 to anywhere. That's after f6 we have knight to f3, and now we have queen to d7 by black. So the idea of playing queen d7 was to give the double protection to the pawn on b5, so that after capture, white knight cannot capture the pawn because the queen is protecting the pawn. But a much better reply at the place of playing queen d7 in this position would have been to play b4. And after b4, first of all, the knight cannot capture the knight because after c to d5, black is having the harmonious pawn structure, which is just completely better for black. So after b4, white is forced to play knight to d1, and after bishop to a6, bishop to d2, after c5, black is having a nice position. But Ian, at the place of playing b4, he chose to play queen d7, a solid chess, keeping the pawn structure as it is. We have e4 by Magnus Carlsen, going for this harmonious pawn structure in the center, having the perfect center. So after e4, the knight is attacked, so black first played knight to b4. If you go for trading up the knights, then after capture b into c3, black is going to face troubles on the queen side, and already e5 is already going to be deadly for black. That's why after e4 we have knight b4 hitting the queen e2, and now we have knight to d3. And after knight to d3, when I was looking at this position during the game, then I thought that black must be having some edge because the knight on d3 looks already very deadly for white. And yeah, the knight on d3 is just perfect, and black is a pawn up, but okay, white is having the nice center which makes the position equal. And now we have the best reply from the white side by playing e5. The idea of e5 was very simple. First of all, making a diagonal for the bishop to attack on the rook at some point. And now white is already threatening to capture the pawn on b5. So after e5, we have bishop to b7 by black, the best practical choice. Even after capture, the bishop cannot capture the bishop because the queen is protecting the bishop. So we have e into f6, and at the place of bishop b7, if you go for trying to capture the pawn, which would not be the best idea, because now comes knight into e5 hitting the queen, and after queen into d4, knight into c6, knight into c6, bishop into c6, rook to b8, and after a into b5, the pawn on a7 is hanging, not hanging because the queen is protecting it, but having a large amount of pressure, and white is having the perfect position, which gives a better position to white. That's why capturing the pawn would not be the best idea. We have bishop b7, and now we have a pawn trade, and now we have knight to e4 now. And after knight e4, you can see that black is having the opportunity to capture the pawn on d4, but we have knight to a6. If you go for capturing the pawn on e4 with the bishop, on the pawn on d4, then after knight into d4, queen into d4, white is having a powerful move, knight to g5, hitting the pawn on e6, and it's a double attack. So after something like queen d7 protecting the pawn on e6, we have queen to e4. And now black can't even play c5 because it's a double attack, and second, white is already threatening to checkmate the black king on h7. Already game over for black. So we have knight to a6, and now we have knight to e5. Bishop into e5. If you go for capturing the pawn on d4, then after knight into f6 check. Rook into f6, definitely capturing the pawn is not a good idea because knight into c6 is already winning. Because the pawn is hanging, the queen is hanging, everything is falling apart. So after knight into f6, we have rook into f6, and after a into b5, queen into e5, because you cannot capture the pawn because simply the bishop is hanging. So you can go for capturing the knight, queen into e5, and after queen into e5, knight into e5, b into a6, bishop c8, and after rook d1, white is a pawn down, but white is having the bishop pair, everything is falling apart from black side, and white is better in this position, actually winning. So queen into d4 would not be the best idea. So Nepomniachtchi already saw that, and he went for a trading of the minor pieces. We have knight to c5, and now it's a danger. It's actually the best square for the knight to come on b3, and then the knight on b3 and the knight on e6 is going to e3 is going to be already deadly for white. So after knight to c5, white played knight to d6. Yep, the best square for the knight from the white side. We have knight to b3 by black. hitting the rook. And after knight to b3, white played rook to b1. And we have knight into c1, rook into c1, knight into c1, and now we have rook into c1. But actually, the best reply in this position at the place of playing rook to b1 would have been to play bishop to e3. And after knight into a1, rook into a1, white is still having the bishop pair. Although white is exchanged down, but it's much better version from the previous version, because after knight into c1, rook into c1, white is still exchanged down, but white is not having the bishop pair, which gives in this position black is better actually. White is exchanged down, but the knight on d6 is already very deadly for black, which is actually perhaps equal, but black is definitely having the edge. So after rook into c1, Nepomniachtchi with the black pieces played rook to b8, protecting the bishop. We have rook d1, idea is to move the knight, and the queen is attacked on the d7. So here bishop simply went back to a8. So here the knight cannot capture the bishop, and it doesn't matter if you do anything. If you first of all go for capturing the pawn on b5, which looks the most natural move in this position, black can play queen e7, and here white can play knight d6, and yeah, white is having the fine position. But at the place of capturing the pawn on b5, Nepomniachtchi with the Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces decided to play bishop to e4. And the idea of playing bishop e4 in this position was, now the bishop is looking at the white square weaknesses, and even the queen h5 could be deadly at any time. The pawn on h7 is hanging, and after queen h5, if you try to play g6, there could be some sacrifices ideas from the white side. So bishop e4 was also a fine move, but capturing the pawn would also make the game very interesting. But we have bishop e4, and now we have c3 by black. And at the place of playing c3, a much better move would have been to play g6. First of all, stopping queen h5. Second, now white is no longer making any weaknesses from the black side, and now black king is actually much safer. And yeah, it would have been a good move. But playing c6, c3 in this position gave white the opportunity to play queen to c2. Many of you were thinking why black is simply hanging a pawn. The idea was to play c3. After b into c3, black can play b into a4, and now white is having the pass pawn. So this is what Nepomniachtchi wants. But Magnus first played queen c2, and now the idea is to threatening a powerful attack on h7. So black was forced to defend the pawn, and now we have b into c3, and now we have b into a4. At the place of capturing the pawn on a4, Nepomniachtchi should have kept the position like this, because the pawn structure is perfect. Because in the game what we had was b into a4, and after queen into a4, we can say that black is already having the weaknesses on a7 and c6. If he would have kept the pawn structure like this, and he would have continued the position by playing something king h8, then after something like a into b5, c into b5, bishop into a8, rook into a8, and you can say that black is having the two deadly pawns, which is going to help black in the future. But we didn't have the king h8, and he went for playing b into a4. And after queen into a4, the position is already over. The position is already equal now. Black is having the slight edge, but yeah, because of the exchange. But okay, it's an equal position. We have rook fd8, rook to a1, double attack on the pawn, c5, asking a queen trade, and now we have queen to c4. If capturing the pawn on a7 would not be the best idea, because it's now game over for white, because here we have queen into a7, and after rook into a7, we simply have rook into d6, the deadly move from the black side. And after rook into d6, you cannot capture, because after bishop into e4, black is a piece up. And even after rook into d6, if you go for capturing the bishop on a8, then already rook d2, and now rook b2 is also coming. The pawns are just going to be dead, and it is already game over for white. So that's why queen into a7 wasn't the best move, and Magnus Carlsen already saw that, and he first played queen c4. Now his idea is to capture the pawn on c5, and also putting pressure on the pawn on e6. And now the only way to defend the pawn is to play something like queen c7. The only way to defend the pawn, because you cannot protect the pawn with the rooks, because the c8 square is guarded by the rook, but guarded by the knight. The b5 square is guarded by the queen and the knight. So the only way is to play queen c7. But here queen into e6 is already going to be very deadly for black. So that's why this a much better idea would be to let the pawn on c5 go. So that's why after queen to c4, Nepomniachtchi played bishop into e4, capturing the bishop. We have knight into e4, king to h8, because knight to f6 was already very deadly for black. We have knight to e6 back, knight to d6 back, rook to b6, and now we have queen into c5. And now the position is totally equal. Rook to b8, king to g2, because rook to b idea, there was idea something like rook b1. So white simply moved the king. We have a6. Now the rook is protecting the pawn. We have king h3 by Magnus. So this is how Magnus plays. Many of you were thinking why white is moving the king like this. Why putting the king on h3? Where the king was on g2, you can say that white was facing some white square issues. So Magnus thought that it would be much better to put the king on h3, where there is no white square issues, because now the black pawns are already covering everything. So there is no way for black to attack the king on h3. And white can play f4 at some point in the future, which is a nice idea from the white side. So after king h3, black decided to play rook c6, queen to d4, king to g8, and now we have c4. So white trying to push the pawn on, push his c pawn. We have queen c7, a double attack on the pawn on c4, but the knight on and the queen is guarding the pawn on c4. We simply have queen g4, and here comes the critical position for Nepomniachtchi, because white is threatening to capture the pawn on e6, and you cannot capture the pawn on c4 because the knight is protecting it. So it's already very hard. Even f4, f5 could be the nice idea from the white side. So Nepomniachtchi came with the best idea in this position. He captured the knight on d6 with the rook. And after e into d6, which is forced, we have queen into d6. And after c5, queen into c5, we have queen into e6 check, king g7, rook into a6 capturing the pawn. We have rook f8, f4, queen to f5 check, queen into f5, rook into f5. We have a queen trade, and just look at the position. White is a pawn up, but theoretically this position is equal, and it's a completely drawish position, and it's a classical game. No player is going to make a single blunder, because you can just check out the theory if you don't know how to play the rook end game. The theory says it's an equal position despite white being a pawn up. So after rook into f5, we still have a couple of moves. Rook a7 check, king g8, king g4, rook b5, rook e7. Okay, white is the one who can press in this position, and black can just hold in this position. Rook f5, rook e5, just blocking out the rook, and now white is ready to push his king in the front. We have rook to a7. Trading the rook is definitely not a good idea, because it's completely winning for white. White is going to simply push the pawn. You can go on to capture the pawn, but a white king is going to capture these 2 pawns. And now white has 2 pawns up, going to make a queen. So capturing the rook is not a good idea. Just keep the rooks on the board. We have h4, king g7, h5, king h6, king h4, rook a1, g4, rook check, king g3. We have a pawn trade. First check, pushing the king back, and now pushing the pawn. If you go for capturing the pawn, after rook into h5, it's at 1 pawn, completely draw. So Magnus tried to push by playing g5, and idea is to play f5 and playing rook e7, pushing the king to the last rank. But here we have a check, king f2, rook a1, rook h6, rook a4. White can't capture the pawn because this pawn is hanging. So I tried to play king f3, rook check, king f2, rook a4, and after rook a4 on the move number 58, both the players agreed to a draw. There is no way to counter this position, because you have to bring the king near to the pawn to protect the pawn, or else black is going to capture the pawn. But when you try to come near the pawn, there comes a check. And even if you try to play king e4, I can simply keep giving you check no matter what. You cannot go here because I can simply play rook a6 check, and after something like after something like king e7, I can still give you check at the place of capturing the rook. It's a draw position completely. That is the reason after rook a4, both the players agreed to a draw, and we have the second match result. Again, a draw by both the players. So this second match was very complicated. After the game, Nepomniachtchi said that he played the worst game in his life in the World Championship 2021. But actually, this game was very interesting, very complicated, but very interesting for, you can say, audience, and for us to analyze. This game was just supreme. So first of all, if you like this game, then make sure to like the video, share this video with everyone to know this complicated, crazy, and the interesting game, and make sure to subscribe the channel as well, so that whenever I would be posting the new videos of the next matches, because total 14 matches are going to be played, and the winner and the player winning most of the match is going to be the champion of the World Championship 2021, the winner. So till then, stay tuned and keep watching Chess 5.